You're listening to the Renegade Blitz Podcast, a podcast for Steelers fans by Steelers fans. Follow us on Twitter at Renegade Blitz, read articles on renegadeblitz.com, and like us on Facebook. It's Super Bowl week, and while the Steelers are unfortunately not playing for another championship in Tampa, that won't stop us from bringing you content on the Renegade Blitz. I'm Ty Polk, joined as always by my co-host Chris Ward. To start the podcast, we would like to express our condolences to the Rooney family. The Steelers announced on Saturday night that Patricia Rooney passed away peacefully at her home on the north side. She was 88. Mrs. Rooney was the beloved wife of the late Steelers chairman Daniel Rooney, who passed away on April 13, 2017. They were married for 65 years up until Mr. Rooney's passing. And with that, we welcome in Ryan Scarpino, former Steelers public relations specialist from 2010 to 2016. Ryan, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, guys, I appreciate it very, very much. Always good to talk football, even though the Steelers aren't in the big game. But I'd like to just say, my condolences to the Rooney family. I knew Mrs. Rooney well and Mr. Rooney well. She was a sweetheart, one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. I know they owned a football team, but they didn't act like it. We had many car rides together. She would wait up for Mr. Rooney to get home from road games, and she was just such a sweetheart, and she will be missed. And again, my condolences to the Rooney family on her passing.
Just elaborate on more memories if you have a chance with Mrs. Rooney and Mr. Rooney.
Wow, man, we'll be here all night. I do my best not to scroll on the socials too much. Flipped on Saturday night, and it was definitely a bummer to see the news that she passed. The one memory I always, and I did talk about this the other night on Twitter, was Mr. Rooney passed away in April of 2017, and a couple months later, I ended up leaving the Steelers. And Mr. Rooney passing away was one of those moments where I had to sort of rethink about where I was going in my career and reassess my personal morals and all that stuff, because he was a big part of my career and just my life in general. He was like sort of another grandfather figure. He was just so kind, and he cared about anybody and everybody. We talked way more about life than we did football. And Mrs. Rooney was also a big part of that too. On the way home from road games, no matter how late it was, Mrs. Rooney would usually wait up for him. And I remember one time it was a late road game, and on the way home from the airport, I said, "Hey, I know you don't want to wake the missus, but you maybe want to give her a call just so she can shut the alarm off." And he's like, "Nah, I don't want to wake her. It'll be fine." And we get there, and I'm carrying his suitcase in his bag, and he opens the door, and the alarm goes off at his house, and it is louder than when Troy picked off Joe Flacco in the AFC Championship game. And all I could think about is, oh my God, the SWAT team is going to roll up, and I'm standing there with Mr. Rooney's bags in my hand. And so he gets in there, he turns off the code, everything was fine. And I remember Mrs. Rooney came down the stairs, and she said, "Dan, what's going on?" He's like, "Oh, I just shut the alarm off." And she was like, "Well, why didn't you call me?" So, that's just, they were just they were both just such sweethearts, and they were just wonderful people. And, I know they're reunited again, and, I can't say enough great things about both of them. Many memories, whether that's, going to book signings, or, we would be driving somewhere, and they'd swing by the McDonald's across the street, and, you'd be at the drive-through, and, the worker would be like, "Oh my goodness, that's Mr. Rooney." And they'd say hello. And I don't know, it was just like, they were just so down to earth and humble. Again, it's hard to believe that they owned a football team the way they acted, but they cared about anybody and everybody. And I'll stop now because we'll be here for the next 10 hours.
What McDonald's, may I ask? The one near the stadium?
It's right across the street from their home. I mean, we were many places where, people would just obviously recognize it's Mr. Rooney, but they didn't need anything fancy. he wanted a bite to eat. Hey, let's go across the street. Or they like getting an ice ball at Gus's on the north side. Didn't know what an ice ball was until he took me there one day. I was like, is that a snow cone? He's like, no, ice ball. But no, I mean, I loved their mentality and the way that they treated people, and they cared about people. He never wanted to take his car. He always wanted to take mine. And, I still got that car. It's my first ever car. It's still running. I'm going to upgrade soon. But I remember I'd be like, oh, let's take yours today. And he'd be like, nah, I like yours more. He just loved being entwined with everyone, and I have other friends that work around the league, and they say that like the owner has his own separate wing. Like he never sees like certain parts of the facility. Mr. Rooney knew everybody and everybody. You know what I mean? He didn't have his own separate wing. He didn't have any special treatment. So like, it's crazy to me that like he was just so involved in everyone's, he cared about everybody. I just, that's rare for anybody nowadays, let alone the owner of a professional football franchise.
How did you get this job with the Steelers in the public relations department in 2010?
Yeah, it was all sort of luck, and I'll admit that. I went to college. I wanted to be a sports reporter. I wanted to be on Sports Center. I got out of college. It was tough getting a job. Couldn't really even get an interview, and I actually met the communications director at the time. His name was Dave Lockett, and we connected. Basically, it was just like, he knew my mom actually, and my mom, I went to visit her one day at work, and he was there, and she's like, hey, she's like kind of like hinting like, hey, there's the communications director for the Steelers over there that I told you about. So, I basically just, I had nothing to lose. I went up to him and introduced myself. We talked just about, how everything's going, and I was honest with him. I was like, hey, can't really get an interview, can't get a job. And he's like, well, hey, we got an internship opening, here's my email. So I emailed him, got an interview, and the rest is history. That's my advice. If anybody's listening out there, don't be afraid to talk to people, obviously shout out to my mom who knew of him, and, right place, right time. And, Dave actually moved on to the UFC. Bert took over, and then Bert actually hired me full time. So I'm very appreciative of Bert for believing in me and keeping me on board. Learned a lot from Bert. But again, it's luck. It's all about luck and timing.
And I imagine like a lot of those things that you in the Steelers PR department, it's helped you in your current occupation. What have you been doing after the 2016 season in which you left the Steelers?
Yeah, so I did a complete 180. I took a communications position in public health. I had a great time with the Steelers. It was definitely a tough decision to leave, but at the end of the day, I wanted more professionally and personally. It's nice getting your Sundays and weekends and holidays back, and actually being able to watch the game and have a couple beverages. I work in public health now, and been helping with the COVID-19 response, and it's completely different from football, but I've learned so much just about epidemiology and overdose prevention. So many things that you don't really see or hear, but when you read all these articles, especially with COVID, like I know what they're talking about now. Beforehand, I wouldn't have known. Now I know how to sort of analyze numbers in a different way and whatnot. But yeah, it's different, but I enjoy it. It's nice knowing that I'm hopefully helping people during this COVID response. And again, it's not X's and O's, but it's been very rewarding getting to help as many people as we can get through this pandemic.
No matter what happens, no matter how small the job, we thank you for everything that you do.
Thanks very much. But hey, there are many, many other people, frontline workers, many people in public health right now. You got to thank them too, but I appreciate the kind words.
And Ryan, with the Pro Football Hall of Fame class of 2021 going to be announced this Saturday, we've been wanting to do a podcast talking about Bill Nunn and Alan Faneca, who are finalists this year. But last year, 3 Steelers got into the Hall of Fame with Bill Cowher, Donnie Shell, and Troy Polamalu. The 2 Steelers that you got to work with during your time with the Steelers were Nunn and Polamalu. What was it like working with Polamalu and Nunn?
Man, I took some notes. I wrote down a lot today. So I guess I'd like to start with Mr. Nunn. I sat at the first desk past the trophy room at the facility, okay? And that was a very high traffic area because you walk through the doors, you pass the trophies, and there was my desk. So I started with the Steelers in April of 2010, and my first week there was a lot of repeated patterns. The door would open, you'd hear footsteps, and then you'd hear a voice. And my back was towards the trophies. So you start to learn people's footsteps and patterns and voices. And I'll never forget this one morning. It was early, and I heard the door, and I heard the footsteps, and I didn't recognize the footsteps. And all of a sudden, I hear, "What's up, money?" And I turned around, and I stood up. I introduced myself, and he said, "Hey, I'm Bill Nunn." And I was like, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Nunn." And he kept walking. And I sat down and I was like, "What's up, money?" I was like, I've been called a lot in my life, but never money. Who is this guy? So I sat down, Googled his name, and one of the first articles that popped up was written by Kevin Gorman, who writes for the Tribune Review, and he's a good friend. And it was about Bill Nunn 2 months earlier was elected to the inaugural class of the Black College Football Hall of Fame. And in that class, with Bill Nunn, was Eddie Robinson, Deacon Jones, Jerry Rice, and Walter Payton. And I start reading this article, and fact by fact, his dad was editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, took over the Pittsburgh Courier, never played college football, never coached college football, but he's in the Black College Football Hall of Fame. He was a teammate of Chuck Cooper at Westinghouse High School. Chuck Cooper was the first black NBA player to be drafted. He went to West Virginia State. His teammate Earl Lloyd was the first black player to ever play in an NBA game. And fact by fact, I just kept thinking, how do I not know who Bill Nunn is? I was kind of ashamed at the moment because I'm a huge football fan, born and raised in Pittsburgh. And then I'm sitting there thinking, okay, if I don't know about him, I mean, does anybody else know about Bill Nunn? I know people in the building do, but here we are 11 years later, and he's still not in the Hall of Fame. Like, what is going on? I mean, this guy is responsible for the Steelers 4 Super Bowls. There's no steel curtain without Bill Nunn. There's no dynasty without Bill Nunn. This guy was so ahead of his time. He was doing his homework. He was going to these colleges, black colleges in particular, and he was finding players, Joe Green, L.C. Greenwood, Mel Blount, Dwight White, Ernie Holmes, John Stallworth, Donnie Shell. I mean, these are key players in the success of the Steelers. How is this guy not in the Hall of Fame? And I thought about this like in 2010. Here we are 11 years later. This got to be the year. And I'll stop there. I got plenty more to say. Bill Nunn, rest in peace, was one of the smoothest and coolest people I've ever met. And I'll tell you this, I don't think I ever had a conversation longer than 5 seconds with him. He was always on the move. It was always, "What's up, money?" Or, "Man, your fingers are flying." Like I'd be typing something. He'd walk by, "Your fingers are flying." And by the time I'd look up, he'd be down the hall. He was just so cool and so smooth. And he wasn't around a ton, but when he arrived, it was like a different vibe in the building. When I first started there, big names: Ben, Heath, Hines, James Ferrier, Aaron Smith, Casey Hampton, Brett Kiesel. No disrespect to anybody I didn't mention, but that locker room was filled with names. They won a Super Bowl when I was a freshman in college. They won a Super Bowl when I was a senior in college. But I never, ever put anybody on a pedestal. I mean, you can't act like that, especially when you work in sports. You can be a fan to a certain extent, but, I went in there level-headed, can't be a fanboy or anything like that. And I always kept my composure. But the first time I met Troy, it was like that Head and Shoulders commercial where his hair like fans out. Like it was just so weird. And like I met all the guys, didn't have any sort of like wasn't starstruck or anything like that. But Troy, it's like he wasn't human, but he was. He was funny. He could time a joke. He was just so humble and great person, great human being, great family person. And, you know, I've never seen somebody that good and act like he wasn't. You know, I mean, it was always praise for Coach LeBeau or his teammates, you know, and I don't know if we'll ever see another Steeler like that. But he was awesome. And I'm very, very grateful I got to work with him. And, you know, I know I joked about this last year when he finally got in, but like, he's that type of person that would say, like, no, I'd let Alan Faneca get in the Hall of Fame before me. Like, and I mean, that's really who he was. He was team first, never about me, team. Glad he didn't have to wait longer than he had to get in.
And Ryan, you also mentioned that you're a lifelong Pittsburgher. So what were your thoughts on Bill Cowher and Donnie Shell being nominated in the Centennial class last year? And do you think Alan Faneca finally gets into the Hall of Fame this year?
Oh man, you know, so I was born in '87, and I frankly don't remember anything about the last couple years with Chuck Noll. Absolutely remember Bill Cowher early on. It's hard not to think of the chin or the scowl or whatever. And like, when you look at old pictures of Cowher, you know, he had that like starter mock turtleneck and like the starter jacket. It looked like he was never smiling. But, you know, I think that the one thing about Cowher is that, you know, he worked his tail off. And he's a Pittsburgh guy as well, but, you know, he was always so close, you know, and he had a couple losing seasons, but, you know, one thing about, you know, the Rooney family is they believe in their coaches. You know, they've only had 3 coaches since 1969, and it was great to see Coach Cowher win a Super Bowl before he finally left. But I mean, you know, those 90 Steelers with Blitzburg, you know, Kevin Green, obviously, rest in peace, Kevin Green. He just passed away recently, but I'm just really happy for Coach Cowher that he won Super Bowl 40. He just worked his tail off, and they were always just super close. And then Donnie Shell, 74 class, Bill Nunn, getting back to Bill Nunn. You know, everybody knows the 74 draft. Donnie Shell wasn't even drafted. You know, I know the talk is that there's a Steelers bias, but, you know, Donnie Shell is an undrafted free agent, one of the best defensive players in Steelers history, and there's been so many of them. But you know, so there are times when you can't be biased when somebody's that good. So I'm very happy for Donnie Shell. I met him a few times. Very nice guy. But again, man, Bill Nunn, diamond in the rough, South Carolina State. That's pretty good when you draft 4 Hall of Famers and then you sign one that wasn't drafted, and then he eventually gets in the Hall of Fame, same class. That's incredible. I don't know if that'll ever happen again.
Of course, also Alan Faneca, he could be another person in that class as well. I mean, do you believe that he finally gets in there as well?
I hope so. I mean, it's unfortunate because like there are times in the Hall of, like, I'll get back to Allen, but like Hines has been up for a while now too. And Hines is just in a really, really, really tough spot because Hines is up against one of the, you know, the flashiest positions, and he's got a stiff competition. And that's no disrespect to Hines, but you can't tell me that Allen isn't one of the best guards in pro football history. I think he only missed 2 games, one because of injury, one because I think Coach Cowher sat them. The guy moved more earth for Bettis. Ask Jerome. I mean, Jerome's always going to give credit to his fullbacks and his blockers. That play in Super Bowl 40, Willie Parker, that's Allen kicking out. And you can't tell me he's not one of the best guards in NFL history. This got to be his year. I hope it is. I mean, I remember Allen. He had a long, like, red hair. He was just a monster. I grew my hair when I was younger because of Alan Faneca and a couple other rock stars. But, you know, Allen was just, and I've met Allen a couple times, super nice guy, great community guy. But yeah, this got to be his time.
One of the similar things right now going on with the Steelers is potentially the thoughts of change. Of course, Ben Roethlisberger seems like going to be returning, but I want to take us back to April of 2015 with Troy Polamalu retiring. Of course, in the previous years, there were a lot of Steelers moving on from their careers. Hines Ward was one of them. Did you see the culture change from when you first got there to 2010 to compare to your last few years with the team?
Yeah, and I don't think that's crazy to say because when you lose sort of, I talked about coming there and there were so many veterans. It's natural, you lose your vets, people come and go, but I remember Jim Wexell has a book on Troy. Jim's a good friend of mine, and I talked about this a couple times in his book, and I'm very fortunate for Jim to ask me to talk to him about it. But as the days went on, you started to see younger guys arriving and obviously, veterans going. Writers have wrote about this many times, but there was a moment when Ryan Shazier as a rookie had his music up and Troy was doing an interview and he literally just walked over and turned it off. And, and we all kind of laughed, but Ryan knew okay, I'm not going to turn my music on anymore. And the defensive backs were doing Flex Fridays or something like that. And they were posing with their shirts off. And I remember Troy being in the middle of an interview, hold on a minute, I have to take my shirt off and go post for a picture. And then he laughed. You could absolutely tell that it was changing. And, even though they still had guys on the team, Willie Gay and whatnot, but the defensive back group was getting younger and to each their own. You see now guys, they like their social media, they like their brand, and that's fine. And I totally get it. But I remember when Troy retired, it was almost okay, there are veterans on the defense, but that last piece to those Super Bowl teams is gone. And that's just how life is. Nothing lasts forever. Troy didn't say much. He didn't have to, though. And, I think that the mood changed, the culture changed with him going. But though they were successful after Troy, they haven't had a losing season. But, yeah, absolutely. You could tell that there was definitely something missing when he left.
And it's an interesting situation right now with Ben Roethlisberger, who will turn 39 in March and is on the final year of his contract. And Jim Wexell mentions in his book, I just got finished reading it on Polamalu, that Art Rooney too, Mike Tomlin, and Kevin Colbert all told Polamalu that he should retire or they would cut him. Polamalu was quoted in the book saying that Colbert told him he's old and slow, and Polamalu agreed that he didn't have the speed and explosion anymore. Polamalu ultimately retired as he didn't want to play with any other organization but the Steelers. What are your thoughts on how it all ended with Polamalu as a Steeler?
I wasn't part of any of those conversations. Those are way above my pay grade. But, I trust Jim. I trust Troy in that conversation. I wasn't in the room, so I can't speak to it. I think anybody that watched that 2014 season could tell that Troy wasn't the same as he used to be, and that's okay. But yeah, I can't speculate on what was said in that room.
Well, we'll approach that in a different way. Just I imagine I've also had the opportunity to be a part of an organization as an intern. It was with the Penguins, and just seeing some of the how the organization goes from a communication standpoint is different. Just writing. I don't know if you were the one that wrote that press report or potentially had that opportunity to see it, but just talk about being in the room whenever Troy officially announced his retirement.
I'd have to go back, but I believe it was a Friday, and that's always fun. It was a Friday during the off season. I'm fairly certain it was a Friday because it was okay, probably get out a little bit early today. and I remember you could tell something was going on, but nobody was saying anything, and it all just sort of happened. I actually believe Jim tweeted that he was retiring. And I just remember seeing it on Twitter. I was like, oh, there goes the early day. And, I when it happened, Troy never really talked. So it wasn't like he was going to have some press conference or anything like that. But I do remember when I saw it on Twitter, I was immediately sad, because I wasn't part of those conversations. There's conversations that go on behind closed doors all the time. Who knows? People have arguments and whatnot, but I knew when Jim tweeted it, I knew Troy trusted Jim, and Troy didn't really do many interviews or talk to many people. So I knew when Jim said it was true. But I just remember being really sad. And then, looking up stats on Troy and putting some paragraphs together. And collaborating with the PR team on when we were going to announce it, how we were going to announce it, and, other details.
Yeah, man, it's always wild whenever you in the room and like, here comes the news. It's like when I was the big news, as small as it is, Carl Hagelin got traded. And it was like, Oh my God, that's a championship piece for 2 cup teams. Oh, okay.
Heath retired on a Friday too. The very next year, I'm pretty certain. It was like 2 back-to-backs on a Friday in the off season.
All reports so far indicate that Art Rooney too, Mike Tomlin, Kevin Colbert are all on board with Ben Roethlisberger coming back this year. So it doesn't seem like they're going to do what they did with Polamalu by basically forcing him to retire. What are your thoughts on Roethlisberger reportedly returning for another season?
I just double-checked. Troy did retire on a Friday. It was April 10th. I knew my mind wasn't gone yet. And again, I don't know what was said to Troy. I wasn't in the room, but it has to be very, very hard for a coach or a franchise, an owner, a general manager to have those conversations with the quarterback that basically brought the Steelers back to Super Bowl contenders year in and year out. It had been a long, long time since the Steelers had a quarterback like Ben. Obviously, Bradshaw comes to mind, but, in between Bradshaw, you have your Mark Malones and Neil O'Donnells and Bubby Bristers, Cordell Stewarts, Tommy Maddox. So, Ben helped bring the Steelers back, and, he's been here for so long. He's done so much for the organization. I know they were 11-0 last year and everything was looking good, but defenses figured it out. It's no mystery of what happened. I don't know if it's schematics. I don't know if it's Ben's health. I don't know if it's lack of cohesiveness on offense. I don't know if that means Ben is done. I know that the conversations are fluid. I absolutely know that for certain. This isn't going to be a knee-jerk reaction or anything like that. And I just think that they'll meet, they'll go over it, and they'll see what happens. Do I think Ben is done? No. And I say that because I just know Ben's a competitor, and I know he doesn't want to go out like that. I have been wrong many times in my life, and I don't want to put money on that. But we'll see. Matt Canada has been there a year. They just promoted Adrian Clem, offensive line coach. So, we'll see. But if I had to put money on it, I would say Ben is definitely back next year.
No doubt.
Probably with I would say absolutely with some sort of money movement. And I've never understood the salary cap when I worked there, and I don't now. I trust that the Steelers will find a way to move some money around so that they can re-sign some players and bring in some players.
We don't understand it either. We had to bring in a British guy for it. Of all things, they have to deal with transfer windows over there, but he understands the salary cap way more than we do. So
I don't know if I'd be able to convert pounds to dollars, but I got to get a better hobby. So maybe I got to start doing that.
As I mentioned, I shared a little bit of like the media stuff that I've had to do. Of course, I imagine as a PR person, what's the wildest situation in a press conference that you've ever had to deal with as a PR guy?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Give me a second here.
I'm sure there was a lot of wild situations. As you know, and as we all know, Pittsburgh media, sometimes they like to go for the jugular.
I still talk to the media guys, and I'm close with a lot of them, and, they just got a job to do. But, Coach Tomlin is not the same person you see on his Tuesdays. He is very, very smart. Before he took a coaching internship, and Bill Stewart, the late Bill Stewart at VMI, got him his first start. Tomlin was about to take the LSATs. He was going to be a lawyer. Mike is smart. Mike is smarter than you think. He only gives you a little bit. I was fortunate that where there weren't too many crazy things during a press conference. I will say, though, that after the Jacoby Jones tripping incident, that was a really weird press conference. And myself and the intern used to have to transcribe that press conference. And that was legit like 45 minutes, like one of the longest transcriptions we ever had to do. And it was like just a constant repetitive, like, I obviously didn't mean to trip him. And like, it was just like continuously, like, asking the same question and repeating the same statement. So that's probably the worst. But I do remember a reporter early on. I won't name his name, but he's no longer here too. He's a TV reporter, and he used to like try to like kind of joke with Coach. And I remember like it was during a Halloween week or something, and like he tried to like, I don't know, like lighten the mood, and he asked like Tomlin what he dressed up as, and it was like the worst timing ever. And like, I'm pretty sure Coach just stared at him. And like, I was just like, oh man, like, why'd you ask that question? Like, this is not the time. But I mean, it was Coach is a pro. He didn't say anything. He knew what he was doing. He laughed about it when he left the room, but it was like, why would you ask that right now?
No favorite Tomlinism?
I tweeted this a couple weeks ago just because the nameless gray faces came up when Juju was talking, and because I had to transcribe him. There were so many times where he would say, he's an all-pro perennial caliber type player, Pro Bowl perennial caliber type player. It is what it is. Try to think of some other ones. Popcorn, high motor, high pedigree. I don't know. I don't know if I could pick a favorite. I think I did my top 5, but nameless gray faces is pretty good. We don't live in our fears. Again, Mike knows what he's doing. But I hate to say it, I like what he says, quite frankly. I think it's like, or to be honest with you, quite frankly, obviously, like I like those. I know he gets mocked for it, but he's a smart coach, and I like Coach T. I think he does a great job. And I think that he's unfairly measured by Super Bowls. And I know that it's been a long time since 2008, but there are a lot of other teams in the league that would love to have Mike Tomlin. So I'm glad he's here.
In Andrew Conti's book on Bill Nunn, he mentions that scouts or members of the Steelers organization always looked forward to drive Nunn home after the workday was done because they cherished all the knowledge they gained from Nunn during that car ride. What did you learn from Nunn during your time with the Steelers, and did you ever get the opportunity to drive him home?
You know what? I didn't get the opportunity to drive Mr. Nunn home. I used to drive Mr. Rooney to a ton of places, so home there. So I have more knowledge with Mr. Rooney, but I would say that I actually learned more about Mr. Nunn after he passed through folks like Kevin Colbert and Brandon Hunt. But like I said, Mr. Nunn, he was always on the move, and we had a quick conversation. But he was 89, I believe 89 when he passed, and I remember going to his funeral. And the one thing that struck me the most was all of the former scouts from the Steelers that were working somewhere else, but also scouts from across the league that came to pay their respects. And to me, that's all I needed to know. These folks loved Mr. Nunn, and they loved, his knowledge, his wisdom. When I was an intern, I didn't want to ruffle any feathers, but, looking back on it, I wish I could have talked to him more. He wasn't there a lot. He was always close with the scouts. But, when I talked to Kevin Colbert and Brandon Hunt, the one thing I learned about was, obviously he was, playing with a stacked deck because, he was a black man scouting the South during segregation. Brandon Hunt and Kevin Colbert both told me that he used to sleep at coaches' homes because he couldn't get a hotel room because of his skin color. Eddie Robinson, Ramblings coach, who went into the inaugural Black College Football Hall of Fame with Mr. Nunn, he used to stay at Eddie Robinson's house. And I didn't know that. It's not like talking with Kevin and Brandon. And the one thing that Kevin told me that I thought was pretty cool was just, Kevin was talking about scouting now and the combine and all that stuff, and everything's just so homogenized. Everybody has the same information. Everybody has the same medical. And Mr. Nunn was way ahead of his time, especially when, everybody talks about the Stallworth, how the Steelers found John Stallworth, and goes to see Stallworth run with other scouts, and they're there. Stallworth runs, it's a wet track, and he's not that great. And Nunn stayed an extra day to watch him run on a dry track. Nunn gets the times that he wants, goes back home, and he's reporting to the scouting staff and Coach Knoll. And apparently at that time, there was a single tape of Stallworth's highlights. And whether the Steelers shared that with other people, we'll never know. But basically, Mr. Nunn kind of, I don't want to say pulled a fast one, but Mr. Nunn knew what he was doing. Like, I've heard from sources that he kind of told the other scouts that were there that day, nah, this guy can't run. I'm going to go home. And he stayed that extra day. And then John Stallworth ends up getting drafted to go to the Hall of Fame. So this guy was smooth. He was cool. And I wish I would have talked to him more. But I'm glad that I got to have casual conversations with him and just be a part of sort of his expertise. Because I know that folks like Kevin Colbert and Brandon Hunt and anybody that worked at the Steelers, he had this presence. He had sort of this magic, and he was just a really smooth guy and cool guy.
Something I want to talk about is Kevin Colbert. I listened to Dejan Kovacevich's Quick Hits on DK Pittsburgh Sports Radio. He mentioned that sometimes when he tries to talk to Kevin Colbert, he tries to direct the conversation away from football. He mentioned frequently that Kevin wanted to talk more about the Pirates or the Penguins more than his own football team. I'm interested to know stories about your time around Kevin Colbert and maybe even Brandon Hunt, because they're the guys that you really probably see maybe once for around the scouting combine, and really they hide away for the rest of the year. Yeah,
Kevin, I'll start with Kevin. Kevin has had a huge impact on my career and my personal life. He's a mentor. Much like Mr. Rooney, his door is always open for any conversation that you want to have. 90% of the conversations Kevin and I had were not about football, not even about sports. He is just a humble, down-to-earth individual, just much like Mr. Rooney. That sort of mentality is contagious. But Kevin is a super smart, hard worker, blue collar, Pittsburgh guy. Only had one losing season since he's been the Steelers general manager. And if you think about that, that's incredible. Kevin's just great. I can't explain it any other way. He always took care of me. He would come down, he'd have extra Penguins tickets or Pirates tickets. And I'd be like, Kevin, nah, I'm good. He's like, come on, take them. He always called me Pino. No one ever called me Pino. My nickname's always been Scarps. But it was a very early on, and he'd always bellow it out, Pino. But the one thing I loved about Kevin the most was that, and I'm not going to do it on here, but if they needed a laugh, they would come to me. He would call me on the phone and be like, Pino, get down here. We're tired of watching 40-yard dashes. I'd walk into the scouting room with a full scouting staff, full coaching staff, and do an impression of Danny Smith in front of Danny Smith because the GM wanted me to. And you know what? It was a lot of fun. It was intimidating to a certain extent, but if the GM needed a laugh, he trusted me. But if the GM needed how many times this player fumbled in the last 5 years, he came to me too. So he trusted me because he knew I could deliver the information, whether that was a statistic, some sort of report or bio, whatever he needed, but he also trusted me to deliver a laugh. And when their reports were that Kevin was going back to the Lions, I was upset because I didn't want him to go, and I didn't text him, whatever. But I haven't been there in 3 years now, but I text Kevin anytime he gets back to me. He's the best. And Brandon Hunt, I really, really, really hope Brandon Hunt gets a general manager position. He is a bright young guy. He's a Pittsburgh guy too. Much like Kevin, Brandon is humble. Brandon knows his stuff. Great people, really smart folks. When Kevin does hang it up, I hope Brandon is the next Steelers GM. But if not, Brandon will get his opportunity one day, and deservedly so. Very grateful that I got to work with him.
Real quick, I want to ask, because of course with PR, it's obviously handling like some of the post-game interviews, but way more to it. It's almost you're kind of like a sports information director. What are the other details that go into PR for a sports team? Just so people can know.
I used to joke, people would be like, well, what do you do during the off season? People would always ask, what do you do during the off season? Well, like, it's constant updating the roster. Like, people don't think about those things, but like, who's a free agent, who's not, creating separate rosters so you can add and replace folks, getting the media guide updated. You're updating player bios, you're updating Steelers history, you're updating records, you're updating coach bios, Mr. Rooney's bio. You got planning for the game day program for the next season, getting ready for the draft, setting up tables in the media room, trying your best. Well, it's different now with COVID because you're doing everything via Zoom, but we'd make prepared for the combine, preparing for the owners meetings, making certain people available. So there was never really an off season. I always just called it, we got our weekends back to a certain extent. Besides, coordinating interviews during the season and whatnot, your practice, you're putting out fires left and right. There was no job too big or too small at the Steelers. Sometimes that was taking Mr. Rooney home and then coming back to finish the media guide work. Sometimes it was giving a tour of the facility to the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, or Dale Earnhardt Jr., or a 5-star general. It didn't matter. There was no off season. It was a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong. I'm very grateful I got to work there. We could be here all night if I kept on going.
And with the Super Bowl game coming up on Sunday, it's a game full of connections to the Steelers and the city and the team. Bruce Arians and Byron Leftwich, along with Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, to name a few, will coach or play in the Super Bowl on Sunday. What was it like working with Brown and Bell during your time in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I know a couple years ago there was a tweet that I was a part of that didn't go down too well, but I never had a problem with Antonio or Le'Veon when I worked there. Good for them. Wish them the best. I wish it would have turned out differently when when they played for the Steelers. I also worked with Byron Leftwich for a couple years. I worked with Bruce Arians a couple years. At the end of the day, they're all super hardworking and dedicated, and I'm happy for them that they're in the big game. Antonio was doing incredible things during his time with the Steelers. Le'Veon was probably the best back in the game for a couple year stretch. I'm glad that Bruce landed on his feet after he left the Steelers with the Colts and the Cardinals and now the Buccaneers. And I hate that, I'll probably get a lot of flack for this, but it is kind of cool to see Tom Brady in it again. Because I feel like if Ben had 6 Super Bowls, we would all be excited as well. Again, I'm happy for all those guys and wish them the best. I know it can't end in a tie, but we'll see what happens Sunday night.
And Bell never really seemed to be much of a locker room issue. He did have some minor issues though, but it seemed like he was overall a pretty good guy, a good guy. When did you start to notice a change with AB, as he once was a fan favorite in Pittsburgh, and Ryan Clark has mentioned in the past when he got his first big contract in 2012 is when he really noticed a change. His exact quote was, "When you give him money, you're going to create a monster." Did you see a notice of a change after he got that contract in 2012?
I don't. That's in the past. I don't want to comment on the internal things that happen. Ryan I like Ryan very much. We still chat every once in a while. But I don't want to discuss the ins and outs of my time there. I never wanted to talk personally about anybody. I always got along with Antonio when I was there. He was always a great teammate, and we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I know he spoke with the media today, and he said that he's been humbled what gone on over the last few years. That Dale Lally wrote for DK Pittsburgh Sports and said that it seemed like he's really turned things around.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously going back a couple years to that tweet, I hadn't worked there. looking back on it, I wish it never have happened. I should have just put the phone away, but I hadn't worked there in a year. I was a fan, and they had just lost to the Chiefs, and Antonio didn't talk to the media, and obviously he said trade me, let's find out. And at the time I was public enemy number one, and obviously the events that transpired after that with Antonio, I had no idea about. I wasn't a part of. I don't know, but at the end of the day, I'm happy. It does seem like he has turned his life around. I don't know what he was dealing with, anything like that. Him and I always got along. I remember my first year there, I picked him and Emmanuel Sanders up on the same day. They both got drafted by the Steelers. So, looking back on it, I probably should have never said anything. But at the end of the day, you can't change the past. He moved on. I moved on. And, I wish him the best. It does seem like, he has turned his life around. And, hey, man, I'm all for second chances. I'm all for, getting whatever help you need or surrounding yourself, whatever, people can help you out. And, I'm sure that helps when it's a 6-time Super Bowl champion winning quarterback that, whether he takes you under his wing. And, kudos to Tom for whatever he's done for Antonio, and kudos to Antonio for whatever he's done for himself and whoever else on that staff and team that has helped him get to where he is. Like I said, I wish him the best. We'll see what happens Sunday night.
And of course, with it also being Super Bowl week, we're interested to get your takes for what the final score of this intriguing Super Bowl matchup. The Bucs, for the first time in probably, I'm pretty sure 1980 was in Los Angeles. So that did have the Los Angeles Rams. So I think this is probably the second time that a team that is hosting the Super Bowl, technically, as they play in it.
I like the technically, because they keep advertising it the first, but I like the technicality. So again, I mentioned this earlier. I am a Tom Brady fan. I know that's blasphemy here, but I do. I picked against Brady last week. I shouldn't do it this week, but I'm going to. I like the Chiefs 34-28. I think Brady will come back next year, but I think that this is the official changing of the guard. I think this is back-to-back for the Chiefs, 2 in a row for Mahomes. I just think the Chiefs have too many weapons. I believe the Buccaneers' safeties are hurt. They were at least last game. But yeah, I think, whether it's Le'Veon or Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Darrell Williams, or, obviously Tyreek Hill, Kelsey, Sammy Watkins, Hardman. I just think the Chiefs have too many weapons. I think they're going to run the ball. I think they're going to have quick throws, and I think they're going to get enough chunk plays. Again, 34-28 Chiefs. I will probably be wrong and eat my words, but so be it. I'm sticking with 34-28 Chiefs.
I think this is going to be another overtime Super Bowl game. I'm going to say at the end of regulation, it's 31-all. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers get a field goal to go up 34-31, but the Kansas City Chiefs repeat on an overtime touchdown to win the game 37-34.
I'll go with Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. I'll say they win 28-21.
Ooh, low scoring.
I think Tampa Bay, their defense has been playing well lately. I think they'll make some plays and hold the Chiefs, limit them at least a little bit. But, 28 points, I'm thinking 4 touchdowns.
We are going a little bit high scoring because as it stands right now that the Super Bowl is supposed to be in a 75% chance for rain down in Tampa. It could be a Florida swamp just like the 2007 Super Bowl, the Colts and the Bears. And it could be really similar.
Who did the halftime show?
Prince.
Yes.
Why not have The Weeknd do it? So
Purple Rain in the rain. Unbelievable.
And of course, I'd be remiss to not ask this, but of course, your first year was the Steelers' last appearance in the Super Bowl. And I understand you may have been an intern at that time, but did you get the chance to travel to Dallas? And if so, how was that experience during Super Bowl week?
Intern, also known as the backbone of the department. So even though I was an intern, I traveled to all primetime away games. I interned 10 and 11. all primetime road games, including the Super Bowl. That first year is the best time I've ever had in my years there. You get to the top. Obviously, I've never played and I've never acted like I played, but it was really, really cool to get to experience that and experience a full season. And I remember coming home after that loss, being on the bus and thinking to myself, wow, this is pretty cool. We'll be here next year. And then just sort of, realizing that, like, I can't take this for granted. And in my time there, the closest we got was my final year there, and Tom Brady ruined that. But it was an amazing experience that first year, 2 straight home playoff games, beating the Ravens, then beating a really, really good Jets team. Those 2 Jets back-to-back AFC title games with Rex Ryan. That defense was great. Mark Sanchez was playing great. They had LT and Thomas Jones. Jericho Cotchery was on that team. Santonio Holmes was actually on that team. It was an unbelievable experience. I'm very happy that I got to go there. I'll, never forget those moments. It's just unfortunate because we were all rooting for the Bears. And Aaron Ryan, I would never say it to the guys, but Ryan Clark actually had talked about this recently, talking about how and he's right. We were all rooting for the Bears because Jay Cutler got hurt. And it would have been, no offense to whoever the backup was. I couldn't remember. I don't even know who his name was, but we all kind of knew that Aaron Rodgers was going to be a problem, and he was.
Yeah, Ryan mentioned that one of the touchdowns, he almost picked off Aaron Rodgers. It's just like it grazed his fingertips just by a little bit. It's a game of inches, as everyone always says, and it's just insane.
Yeah, I read that. And I believe Rodgers pointed at him or shook his finger, like, you almost had that one. And yeah, I remember that specific play because Ryan talked about it, and I remember when he's talked about it many times, but recently it brought back that memory because I remember watching them in practice leading up to the game and seeing familiar coverages. And I don't know if Rodgers could have thrown a better ball if he had another 100 throws. That's how good it was. And I'm sure if you could ever find Troy and ask him, he'd probably say the same thing because it was incredible.
But obviously, with your new position, you just have to ask this. It's a cliche question, but if you had an opportunity to go back to another sports team in the NFL, it could be with the Steelers again. Would you take that chance?
Ooh, no, I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't do sports again. I had an amazing time. I got to see the world. We got to play in London. But at the end of the day, I like my weekends. I like my holidays, and I like watching it more on television, especially, when you're there, you can't be as much of a fan. And I actually remember a point where I didn't enjoy football anymore because it was literally my life. And now that I've moved on from it, I love watching football. When I worked there, I didn't watch Thursday night football. I didn't watch Monday night football. I only ever watched the Steelers game. And now I'm watching football all the time. Doesn't mean I didn't have a great time, and I'm extremely grateful for my time there. I loved it. But again, when Mr. Rooney passed away, I just reevaluated what I wanted professionally and personally, and I have no regrets. Obviously, I wish they would have won a Super Bowl when I was there, but I got to be a part of every game, including the Super Bowl, but we didn't win. But hey, that's a really good question. I appreciate you asking me that. Looking back on it, I have great memories, but I wouldn't change what happened or my decision to leave.
And Ryan, we'll have a couple more questions here, but
yeah.
From Jim Wexell's book, you mentioned how you got Troy Polamalu into a restaurant when it was booked. I think it was a restaurant you mentioned that you used to work for, and you got him in there. Can you share a little bit about that story?
I worked at a restaurant growing up, and it was the only job I ever had before the Steelers. And I worked there, through high school at night, and then, coming home from college in the summer. So one day, Troy from the end of the hall was like, "Hey, Scarps, I literally Had no idea he knew my name, let alone Scarps. And he comes down. We're talking. He's like, hey, I heard you used to work at a restaurant. I'd love to get in tonight. And I was like, sure, yeah, great. He goes out to practice. We were a really good restaurant, top notch. There's no way you're getting in on a Friday night unless you had a reservation. So I'm texting my boss, and my boss is like, we're booked. I'm like, dude, I'm not even joking. It's for Troy Polamalu and his wife. Not joking. So he says, I'll see what I can do. A couple minutes pass. He texts me, good to go, gives me the time. And the whole time I'm like, I can't tell Troy no. Like, how can I tell Troy no? So he comes in after practice. I say, Troy, here's where you need to go. Here's the time. Enjoy. So my boss hooks him up. I was a little bit nervous because what happens if he didn't have a good experience and I had to see him the next day? But everything goes great. My boss texted me. Everything was great. Nobody bothered Troy. Him and his wife showed up. They had a great time. So the next day, so I knew he had a good time. Like I could tell. My boss was ecstatic. So the next day, Troy, I see him. He's walking away. And I was like, Troy, he's like, hey. I was like, hey, how was it? And he was like, Scarps, it was bomb. I'll never forget that. He's literally, Scarps, it was bomb. I didn't even know he knew my name. And I was able to connect him with some high quality food. And apparently he's a foodie. Because I'm reading Jim's book. I saw him drink plenty of smoothies. Didn't really know the ins and outs of his diet other than smoothies. But yeah, he had a good time. I'm glad I got to connect him to some good food.
Yeah, Jim Wexell. I just finished his book recently, and it's an amazing book. And one of the parts that really stands out is after the Super Bowl, the Steelers were at a Super Bowl party, and Snoop Dogg was there, and Mike Tomlin, and everybody. I guess it was really crowded, and Wexell stepped out. And he was talking with Randy Bauman, and Polamalu was leaving with family, and he saw Wexell and Bauman there. So he went over to them, and he had a conversation with them for like quite a while, just talking about X's and O's, and about the game. And I just thought that was really interesting with Polamalu, just how humble he was, and he was really just like a regular human being, just like all of them. But he's just his humility was just amazing.
Yeah, I got a story. It didn't make Jim's book, but I remember when we played in London, there was a pub across the street, and we all went there after we arrived that night. And I remember looking out the window, and I had a couple pints in me, not going to lie. And I remember looking out the window, and there are people everywhere. And I'm like looking out the window, there's Troy just like standing there, just like soaking it all in. And I'm like, so like I walked out, I'm like, are you all right? Is everything okay? He's like, yep, everything's good. I was like, all right, cool. But nobody knew who he was. And I mean, at that point, that was 2013. I think it's a little bit different for the international games now, but I mean, they were, fans over there were still celebrating more when guys were making extra points and field goals and touchdowns. So, I just think that, I think that's the way Troy always wanted to be, not known. And I just I'll never forget that, because if he was in, the Strip District, or he was on the South Side just standing there, everybody would have known who he was. So it's almost like he enjoyed that. And it was just like I'd never been overseas. So I was soaking it all in too, but it was really cool to just look and see this dude's one of the greatest Steelers of all time. And it's soaking in the moment, just like we all are.
All right. Well, we're almost finished with this interview, but being that we're all fans of the Steelers, we got to know, what's your thoughts on the current state of the Steelers and going into next season?
Yeah, I completely understand sort of I don't say panic, but uncertainty. But the Steelers are one of the most consistent franchises in the league. As I mentioned earlier, Steelers have only had one losing season this century, and that was 2003. And the next year they ended up getting Ben. I trust the process. I trust Coach Tomlin. I trust Kevin Colbert. I trust the Rooney family and everybody else involved. They're going to have to make some tough decisions. They're going to have to crunch some numbers. Some guys are going to come, some guys are going to go. I think at the end of the day, though, are they a contender next year? I don't know. It's who knows where we're going to be next year. Are there going to be fans in the stands? Are there going to be home field advantage? Like this was a weird year. It was a weird year. Let's let it all play out, go through the off season, get into training camp and see what happens. But I think that it's reasonable to maybe have some doubts, but I also look at the consistency and the history of the franchise, and I know they have the people in place to compete.
That was Ryan Scarpino, former Steelers public relations specialist from 2010 to 2016. Ryan, it was a great interview, man, and thank you so much for taking this time out of your day.
I really, really appreciate the time. Thanks for having me on. Best of luck to everybody listening out there as we continue through 2021.
And that's all for us on the Renegade Blitz. For Chris Ward, I'm Ty Polk. Thank you for tuning in. We'll have more episodes coming up throughout the offseason with all the latest happenings on the Steelers and, of course, other special interviews as we continue through the 2021 offseason. Thank you for listening to the Renegade Blitz Podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Renegade Blitz, read articles on renegadeblitz.com, and like us on Facebook. Our podcast is available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, YouTube, iHeart, and Spotify.